Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on this issue and hopefully get a final resolution this year. And thanks for your leadership by introducing a Senate version, and thanks for inviting me to this hearing today. When I ran for Congress in 1986, BLM was logging 1.53 billion board feet a year, about 10 times the current level of harvest. They were clear-cutting irreplaceable old growth. They were logging on steep slopes. We had destabilization. We had degradation of streams and threats to drinking waters. Logging 1.53 billion board feet and irreplaceable old growth helped put the spotted owl on the endangered species list. In '86, when I ran, I said that level of harvest was unsustainable. It was. It continues to be out of step with the environmental and social values of most Oregonians. In the '90s, we tried to reform forest management in the Pacific Northwest with something called the Clinton Northwest Forest Plan. I opposed that plan, too. I didn't think it would solve the fundamental problem in Western Oregon, permanently protecting old growth and conservation values while ensuring a predictable, sustainable supply of timber that's necessary to support rural communities and basic county services. Unfortunately, I was right. The pendulum has now swung the other way. Timber harvests on the ONC lands are down 80 to 90%, a reduction beyond anyone's wildest imagination and not necessary to protect critical environmental values. And old growth still lacks protection. Due to the lack of a predictable timber supply, the last remaining mill in Josephine County, a family-owned business for 90 years, recently closed its doors. They laid off 88 people in a rural community with a population of less than 2,000. Josephine County is 70% owned by the federal government, surrounded by federal forests, in need of management, and yet the mill had to close for a lack of timber supply. Current management in the ONC lands has also left rural counties whose budgets are statutorily linked to these lands on the cusp of insolvency. In some counties, there's little or no rural law enforcement. In fact, a year and a half ago, news reports encountered the devastating story of a woman in Josephine County who was assaulted and raped by an ex-boyfriend. He was standing on the doorstep trying to break down the door while she was on the phone with a 911 dispatcher who said they don't have anybody to send. The status quo: bankrupt counties, 15 to 20% real unemployment, 1 out of every 4 people on food stamps, 25% of the school-aged children growing up in poverty, unhealthy forests, lack of opportunity. That's not what Oregonians want either. It's time to move away from the extremes, from the swinging pendulum, to find and legislate a reasonable and balanced solution. Chairman Wyden and I know together, working with the rest of the delegation and the governor, we can do that. You and I, together with the governor and members of the delegation, have agreed to principles: predictable revenues to help counties provide basic services, meet their state-mandated responsibilities, a sustainable, uninterrupted timber supply to create good-paying jobs, support the local infrastructure, and significant, lasting conservation victories like protection for old growth, drinking water, and imperiled species. On the House side, Congressman Walden, Congressman Schrader, and I took our best shot at a balanced plan. It's not the bill any one of us individually would have written, but it's one that we could ultimately agree on and compromise, and one that we believed was consistent with the principles that that I just enunciated earlier. And it did manage to pass the House of Representatives. Our solution used a trust concept. Mr. Chairman, you've made it clear that a trust concept cannot pass the Senate and would likely face opposition from the Obama administration. I still think there's benefits to it. It's a pretty simple approach, but I acknowledge political reality, and I believe our agreed-upon principles can be legislated through a different construct along the lines of the construct you've proposed in your ONC legislation. I believe we'll need to work on changes to the bill in order to get the revenue level of revenues and harvest we need for jobs, employment, and county revenues. We're going to need to expand the land base. We need to look at the public domain lands, the management of the controverted lands, and other ways to creatively, move through this issue. The harvests need to be geographically dispersed to provide for the remaining local infrastructure so we don't neglect the management needs of our forests in Southwest Oregon, which are more fire-prone, and opportunities for litigation over scientifically sound, sustainable timber projects needs to be reduced. And a huge priority for me and the governor is a more coherent policy for protecting our rivers, streams, and aquatic features. In the House bill, we were able to secure language to dedicate 5% of net revenues to protecting rivers and streams on neighboring private lands by purchasing easements from willing landowners to create continuous riparian buffers on private and federal lands, since the O&C lands are a checkerboard. This is something that is supported by industry, the counties, Governor Kitzhaber, who's committed to matching the dollars with state money. If we're going to pass a bill into law, everybody at the table needs to know what they're getting. We need reasonable certainty. The counties need to know the range of revenues they can expect so they can plan accordingly. Local businesses in the timber industry need to know what timber supply can be expected so they can build viable business plans. And the general public and conservation community need to know that iconic, irreplaceable natural treasures will be protected and conserved for future generations. Certainty is going to require compromise. Congress is not going to solve all the county's financial problems. But we can pass a bill that creates jobs, provides a reasonable level of revenues, and gets rural economies growing again. And who knows? Maybe if real unemployment dropped below 15 to 20%, which is the real rate in my rural counties, the voters would vote to pass ballot measures to build on the revenues coming from the federal lands, to have more funding for public safety, public health, and other critical services. Congress can't and won't legislate a 1986 timber plan. But Congress can and should pass a timber plan that increases the volume to a meaningful level. The House and Senate bills propose to increase timber harvest to 30 to 40% of historic levels. That's not unreasonable. It is achievable and can be done protecting environmental values. Finally, more conservation groups need to come to the table and engage constructively in the legislative process. We have better science, data, information, and experience than when the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted. Because we lack this information, the Northwest Forest Plan adopted very conservative protection measures that should be revisited. Thanks to work being done by scientists at Oregon State, we now know that one-size-fits-all riparian protections can, in some cases, be reduced without sacrificing ecological or aquatic function. We now know that some terrestrial and wildlife goals of the Northwest Forest Plan have not been met. The lack of regeneration harvests on O&C lands has led to a deficiency in early seral stage forests, which support numerous species of plants and animals, including elk and deer. Two of the Gang of Four who wrote the Northwest Forest Plan, one of whom is going to testify here today, have proposed cutting-edge science that address this ecological issue and to improve forest resiliency and health in the long term. Questioning the motives of esteemed scientists, the same scientists who wrote the Northwest Forest Plan, many conservation groups like to tout and defend, endlessly challenging and litigating modest scientific demonstration projects, sponsoring misleading and downright false billboards and advertisements back home to scare the general public, and flat out refusing invitations to join with diverse stakeholders to build a balanced Oregon plan for a uniquely Oregon problem. Those things aren't going to work. These same people are advocating for the status quo, but the status quo has failed us. It's failed the children in these counties who have walked up to their county library looking to check out a book from a school for a school project to find a locked door. It's failed the sheriff's department, who've been served, the sheriffs who've been served pink slips because the federal government couldn't live up to its obligations. It's failed the justice system, has been forced to turn a blind eye to criminals as they walk out the doors of the county jail due to a lack of available beds. The status quo has failed victims of horrific violence who've dialed 911 desperately looking for help, only to be told there is no help coming. This is it. This is the best and maybe the last opportunity to fix the crisis in Southwest Oregon before counties completely dissolve. And once they dissolve, we don't know how to get them back. The delegation wants to move forward. Oregon needs to move forward. We need a long-term solution to stop the endless forest wars that are undermining our rural communities, our counties, and the health of our forests. We can do this. Together, I know we can, Mr. Chairman, and we need to get it done this year. Thank you.